On the Common Link Theory, CLT, by Alhomoudi, doctoral thesis, Mcgill University, 2006. The Arab Critics. A long-standing tendency amongst Orientalists has been to ignore contemporary Arab authors completely. Some recent Arab scholars have, however, engaged Schacht's theories, among other Orientalists, although no in-depth critique has yet been produced. A general reluctance to seriously consider Schacht's work is readily noticeable, a reluctance that is part of a wider phenomenon of rejecting flatly and a priori the genre of Orientalist scholarship. The few published reactions can be fairly divided into three categories. 1. Those who dismiss Schacht outright. 2. Extremely general and unsubstantiated criticisms of Schacht. 3. Those who challenge Schacht more directly but are derivative of Azami's work. Critics of the first category dismiss not only Schacht but generally all Western contributions to Hadith criticism, and they do so from a perspective which lacks sufficient familiarity with Schacht's work and wider range of Orientalist discourse. For instance, Abdul Azim al-Mut'ani states that Malik's Muwatta is evidence enough to demolish Schacht's claim that the Sunnah was not considered a source of Islamic law before Shafi'i. This, however, was not Schacht's position regarding Malik's Muwatta. There is little doubt that writers like Mut'ani not only misunderstood Schacht, but issued judgment upon his writing prematurely. According to Mut'ani, Schacht gives the best scholars of early Islamic history an awful depiction. He accuses them of intentionally lying and forging hadiths by putting the latter into the mouth of the Prophet. But the truth is that the lying impostor is Schacht, his colleagues among the Orientalists, and those who follow the direction. Beyond such name-calling, he does not provide any substantial evidence to refute Schacht's claims. Similarly, As-Sibai, who actually met Schacht in person, says little about the substance of his writings. But in an apparent reaction against Orientalists, As-Sibai claims that Schacht wrote an introduction to Islamic law full of falsification and twisted statements in the same way his predecessor did. The critics of the second category acknowledge the content of Schacht's arguments, but only obliquely. Due to the apparent difficulties of accessing Schacht's works directly, their responses are typically generalized attacks. N. Hamdan, for instance, criticizes Orientalists for generalizing, yet he himself commits this error against Orientalists. His approach to Schacht's work is itself a clear case in point. He states that in Islamic jurisprudence and legal theory, Schacht took an extreme position in linking Islamic law with Roman law and tribal customs, thereby calling into question its validity and independence. Hamdan also complains that Schacht was prepared to fault scholars for merely pointing out the links between Islamic law and other laws. Hamdan's critique would have been more convincing and appropriate if he actually analysed Schacht's theories instead of merely attacking his conclusions. The third category includes those few Arab authors who have attempted to challenge Schacht's theories directly, but have not yet developed a credible, independent response. In addition to employing such circular methods of reasoning, as citing the Quran or Hadiths to provide documentation, almost all rely upon Azami's work and other oblique references derived from it. Since Azami misrepresented some of Schacht's theories, the following critical byproducts often replicate and compound his errors, and thus are of little consequence. In his book about research methods in Orientalist writings, Mughli outlines the broad premises of Schacht's argument concerning the origins of Islamic law. Writes, some Orientalists such as Goldziher and Schacht insist on the theory that Hadith are considered as the second source of Islamic law 200 years after the Quran, and that the justification for its appearance was needed for solutions to the problems in different regions. Robinson takes the same position as Schacht on this matter. Mughli reckons that one of the justifications consistently cited by Goldziher and Schacht for their theory is that Hadiths were not written down until 200 years after the Prophet's time. Mughli goes on to claim that Goldziher, Schacht and Robinson's entire scholarly project is invalid, but without addressing any of their proofs or argumentation. His total acceptance of Azami's refutations precludes any further investigation on his part. A more sensible refutation of Goldziher's claim is offered by Ittar, Nur ad-Din Ittar, who is professor of Hadith and Quran at Damascus University. He argues that Hadith began to be written down as early as 35 after the Hijrah. Above and beyond the writing process, Itar was mentioned the memorizing of Hadith, which was the common practice of the people at the time. Itar explains that memorization was a key method of recording the Hadith, and criticizes Schacht in particular and the Orientalists in general for overlooking the fact that this practice is famously attributed to the companions. In his study of Orientalists and their positions on Islamic jurisprudence, As-Sufyani suggests that Schacht did not consider Islamic law as part of the Islamic religion. In other words, he criticized Schacht for separating law and religion in his conceptual approach to Islamic jurisprudence. He further claims that Schacht's theories are constructed upon this assumption, which constitutes grounds to dismiss Schacht's theories in their entirety. Despite the fact that such a vague dismissal is unacceptable, we find that Sufyani relies on only 2 translated books of Azami and some irrelevant primary sources. This kind of study misleads readers through its inadequate analysis of Schacht's theories and typifies the vast gap between scholarly writing in the East and West on topics related to the history of Islamic law. Among other contemporary scholars, al-Bashir investigates some of Schacht's claims regarding the Matan and contrasts them to those held by the traditionalists. His grounds for doing so is the fact that the Hadith may have had authentic isnad, and yet its Matan may be spurious for various reasons, including being shadh or ma'lul, i.e. having illa, weakness. He often points out to numerous similar citations from muhaddiths. One of the most comprehensive studies of Schacht's methodology in the Arabic language is that of Idris, who relies not only on Azami but also on the partial translation of Schacht's origins by al-Bashir. Idris mentions 6 problems in his approach, the first of which is the claim that Schacht has a hidden agenda, but Idris does not explain what it is. Second, Schacht selectively chooses his sources. He did not properly utilize primary hadith sources, but instead relied excessively on fiqh books, especially those like the Risala by Shafi'i. An examination of a wider selection of secondary sources as evidence would have gone further towards demonstrating impartiality. Third, he cites Schacht's suspicion of hadith sources and scant bibliography, casting suspicion upon the accuracy of Schacht's understanding. Fourth, and worst of all, in Idris's opinion, are Schacht's contradictory assertions. One example of this is his e silentio argument as described previously. And Idris conceptualized this problem from information taken from Zafar's article, which was translated into Arabic. Fifth is Schacht's misinterpretation of terminology, which according to Idris is utilized by Schacht to self-serving ends. For instance, Schacht interprets the meaning of fitna out of its historical context in a way that suits his own conclusions. Sixth is Schacht's tendencies towards generalization, which was also mentioned by several other Arab scholars and originated from Azami. On the one hand, Idris addresses Schacht's work more completely than his contemporaries, but on the other hand, his familiarity with Schacht is ultimately limited to the interpretation of Azami. Thus, from the foregoing surveys, a more complete critique began to emerge. Of the Western scholars, Coulson demonstrated the greatest familiarity with Schacht in an academic and personal sense, and Schacht himself paid serious attention to his detailed criticism. Nevertheless, subsequent opponents from the Arab world did not elaborate upon Coulson's work, instead accepting the critique of Azami. The repercussions of Azami's rhetorical mode of criticism detracted serious attention from any informed criticism of Schacht amongst Western scholars, and has misguided the few Arab writers who have bothered to engage this topic. Lessons learnt from past mistakes within these strands of discourse, and a careful reassembling of their insightful points will inform my criticism and guide the emergence of a viable alternative to Schacht's approach to the CLT and more generally to the study of Hadith and Islamic law. Stay tuned.